This is a webinar on Guidance 1, Audit Effectiveness and Auditor Safety. APSCA's Code and Standards of Professional Conduct provides the framework for the actions and activities of members. As noted in the preamble of the Code, which states, the Code and Standards are not intended to be, nor should they be interpreted as full or exhaustive list of the situations, circumstances, or conditions which may comprise compliance and non-compliance. Professional judgment will be required to decide what is adequate, sufficient, and component according to the situations and circumstances of each audit. From time to time, APSCA will issue guidance to provide clarification and case examples on the implementation and operation of the Code. Members are expected to comply with the requirement of such guidance as an extension of the Code. Guidance does not preclude members from performing other services that are not social compliance audits as defined by APSCA. For a social compliance audit, the guidance does not create any new requirements. The requirements for a social compliance audit are framed in the Code and include expectations related to the establishment and execution of a rigorous internal process for the effective identification and evaluation of related considerations to support the professional judgment, conclusions reached, and actions taken by members. The guidance is intended to provide further direction on those applicable requirements and expectations already contained in the Code. We encourage you also read the APSCA's Glossary of Terms for Definitions, which is located on the APSCA website under the Resource Library. Overall, the goal of the Guidance 1 is to understand auditor safety and considerations to enable the effective execution of a social compliance audit. Today, more than ever, regional challenges, health, pandemics, or the ability to travel are considerations which are to be taken into account in order to determine whether a social compliance audit can be effectively carried out. To effectively conduct a social compliance audit, the member auditor must be able to obtain and evaluate sufficient, competent evidential matter to confirm performance related to all areas and scope through effective performance of all audit procedures as outlined in the APSCA competency framework. A key consideration in the effective execution or completion of a social compliance audit is unfettered or unrestricted access. This would include physical access to operations, access to records, and access to workers to perform confidential worker interviews, all of which provide the sources of information and evidence critical to the audit process. In certain circumstances, the general conditions, whether specific to an operation or a geographic area, can create an environment that really limits the ability of the member auditor to properly execute all elements of a social compliance audit, whether as a result of limited access to key elements or threats to workers or unacceptable levels of risk for safety of the member auditor. The definition of a social compliance audit and APSCA's competency framework define the minimum elements in the execution of a social compliance audit. Section 5.2.6 of the Code requires members to establish policies and procedures to ensure the safety, protection, and security of their auditors, and requires auditors to comply with such policies and procedures. Within Guidance 1, there are 4 case examples to clarify. However, there could be many more developed. The bottom line is that this is about the effective execution of a social compliance audit and, more importantly, consideration of auditor safety. Guidance should the conditions related to the execution of a social compliance audit limit the auditor's access or preclude or prevent the effective completion of all required audit procedures, the member should not accept or should delay the audit until such time as the conditions allow for that auditor to conduct all required audit procedures in an effective manner. Additionally, if in the professional judgment of the member the conditions related to the execution or completion of a social compliance audit present an unacceptable risk to the safety of the auditor, the member should not accept or should delay the audit until such time as the conditions allow for the auditor to complete the audit in a safe and effective manner. Conditions that prevent the effective execution or completion of a social compliance audit might impact other services differently. It is a requirement of members to clearly define the scope of any service and, to the extent of a service is a social compliance audit, to ensure that the social compliance audit is conducted in full compliance with the requirements of the code. While not exhaustive, the case examples are intended to provide a view on the application of Guidance 1. Here we have Case Example 1, Worker Interviews. A member firm was requested to perform a social compliance audit at a facility where the member firm, from previous engagements, understood that management had created an environment where the potential spaces for worker interviews may be subject to surveillance or observation, and workers understood that all discussions may be overheard by management. Previously, there had been indications that there had been consequences or penalties for workers who made comments that could be understood as negative toward factory management. In this case, alternative locations are not possible. Presently, there is no sense that the factory would allow unfettered or unrestricted access for the performance of confidential worker interviews. In this situation, the member firm should follow appropriate processes and steps to evaluate the ability to effectively conduct a social compliance audit at this facility. Based on the facts and circumstances, there is an expectation that an auditor could not perform all required audit procedures in an effective manner. On that basis, members should not schedule or perform a social compliance audit at this facility. However, to the extent that there were changes in conditions allowing for performance of all audit procedures, a member could accept and perform the social audit. So, as stated in the guidance provided, conditions that prevent the effective execution or completion of a social compliance audit might impact the completion of other services differently. This example is focused on worker interviews. It could be that the room is perceived to not be private. There are concerns over management watching to try and intimidate, or recording to know who said what. There are a number of reasons that there could be concerns over worker interviews. Prior to going to the factory, if known already enough or on the day of the audit, discussions with management should occur to discuss how unrestricted access to conduct confidential interviews will be conducted. If known before and unable to develop a suitable plan, the audit may be required to be canceled or postponed until a suitable solution has been agreed to. Contact client to discuss as a full social compliance audit cannot be performed without unrestricted access to workers for interviews. A limited scope or other type of audit may be able to be conducted. Case Example 2. This is on auditor safety. A member firm was requested to perform a social compliance audit at a facility. In the past, there had been instances where factory representatives suggested to an auditor that a negative audit result would have significant consequences for the auditor and the auditor's family. In this case, the member firm should follow the appropriate process and steps to evaluate the safety risk for the auditor and any potential steps to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. After consideration of threats viewed to be credible, and if steps to mitigate the risk could not be implemented, there should be an expectation that an auditor could not effectively perform the social compliance audit, and members should not accept or perform a social compliance audit at this facility. To the extent that there were changes in conditions at the facility at some point in the future or other factors mitigating the risk to the auditor, potentially including changes in ownership and management of the facility, a member could logically accept and perform the social compliance audit to the extent that there were no longer significant safety risks to the auditor. Further, as stated in the guidance provided, conditions that preclude the effective execution or completion of a social compliance audit might impact the execution of other services differently. This example really focuses on auditor safety. So this could be a factory anywhere in the world. This could be as extreme as management has ties to the mafia, or they fear they'll lose their business if they don't receive a suitable result. Thus, they let the auditor know that an audit with negative results will have significant consequences to the auditor and/or their family. If known to have occurred at prior audits, or to avoid the member firm can really make arrangements to ensure the auditor's safety. And this might include security guard accompanying the auditor, multiple auditors on site, and other options. If known prior, the members should really ensure an analysis has been completed to ensure the safety of that auditor. If an unacceptable level of safety cannot be achieved, the audit should not go ahead. If the auditor is on site when they begin to feel threatened or they fear their safety, steps to reduce or eliminate that risk to the auditor and safely evacuate them from the facility should occur. This may even include ceasing or abandoning the audit even though it hasn't been completed. Auditor safety in this case is paramount. The next example is case example 3 on health risks. A member firm was requested to perform a social compliance audit at a facility located in an area considered a hotspot with significant incidences of disease involving an easily transmittable infection or disease, let's say such as COVID-19. In planning the social compliance audit, the facility indicated that they had not taken any practical steps to avoid exposure or transmission of the infection, and there had been cases recently reported among the workers in the facility. So in this situation, the member firm should follow the appropriate process and steps to evaluate the health risk for the auditor and really identify any potential steps to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. If the member firm reasonably concludes the auditor would be in an environment that presented a significant risk of exposure to the disease and there were not appropriate steps being taken at the facility, example, there's no screening, no personal protective equipment, that sort of thing, to help really mitigate that risk, then the member firm should not schedule or perform a social compliance audit at this facility. Now, if there were changes in conditions or sufficient safety precautions were being taken, a member could accept and perform that social compliance audit to the extent that there were no longer any significant personal health risks to that auditor. This past year has really highlighted this issue. While we refer to COVID, obviously that issue could extend well past COVID once COVID ends. So ensuring the safety of the auditors from contracting and then transmitting a disease in other factories is really an important consideration. Firms should follow steps to evaluate any health risk for auditors and ID and steps to reduce any risk to an acceptable level if possible. If this is not possible, this audit should not be scheduled or called out at the factory. If changes occur, the situation should be reassessed, and if risks no longer exist, then the auditor can continue to schedule their audit. Our last case example is number 4 on auditor safety. A member auditor was performing a social compliance audit at a facility where the related member firm had previously conducted an audit without an issue. During the factory walkthrough and management interviews, factory management gave the member auditor a sense that their safety would potentially be at risk if the overall result of the audit was not positive for the factory. In response to the situation, the member auditor contacted the member firm to report the circumstances with the factory and the related safety concern. After consideration of the threats, which were viewed to be credible, and the fact that there were no immediately available steps to mitigate the risk, there should be an expectation that the member auditor could not effectively perform the social compliance audit, and the audit should be immediately terminated. To the extent there were changes in conditions of the facility at some point in the future or other factors mitigating the risk of the auditor, potentially including changes in ownership and the management of facility or a manager, could logically accept and perform the social compliance audit to the extent there were no longer significant safety risks for the auditor. Case example 4 is focused on auditor safety again. However, the known safety becomes obvious only during the audit. After analysis by the auditors on site, they report to their firm with regards to the circumstances. After consideration of the threats and after they've been considered credible, there appears to be no immediate, to the extent that there were changes in situation with limited risk, that are no longer harming. This concludes our Guidance 1 webinar. Thank you for tuning in.